Welcome everyone to this Career Pathways workshop on the basics of science communication. I want to thank all of you for joining, and just as a quick reminder or to help those of you who might not be familiar with the Career Pathways program, the Career Pathways program is a university-wide career and professional development available to all ODU graduate students. It is a program that will allow you to complete either a Preparing Future Faculty or a Preparing Future Professional certificate as one way to kind of build those credentials as you think about your careers post-graduate school. I'm excited that we have Dr. Michelle Covey here to host this workshop. I've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with Michelle and actually learned quite a bit of the basics of science communications from her. So I hope that you will all benefit from this workshop. I've asked that you please type your name and graduate program in the chat so we know who is here. And periodically over the presentation, we will pose some questions for you to respond in the chat as well. We will have Q&A at the conclusion of the presentation, so please save those questions. If you do have clarifying questions, please type them in the chat. We will answer those questions, the clarifying questions during the presentation, but the rest of those questions we will save till the end. So I will go ahead and welcome Dr. Michelle Covey. She'll introduce herself, and please make sure that your microphones are muted during the presentation. And Michelle, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. This is such an honor to be able to talk to you all, and thanks so much, for inviting me. I was at, if you read the little blurb about my background, I was at ODU for 6 years. And very much enjoyed living in Norfolk and being part of the ODU faculty. So I'm going to wind back a little bit and tell you a little bit how I got into the kinds of communication works that I do. My background, my undergraduate and my master's degree were both in science areas. So I have a bachelor's degree in biology, geology, and I did a master's degree actually here at University of Georgia. So I'm kind of returning again to University of Georgia with this job. And that degree was in zoology, but it was in marine science and doing ecological research in salt marshes. And then I kind of took a detour and started doing work in communities. And for about 15 years, I did some college teaching, but also was the executive director of a nonprofit organization that did environmental education. And that nonprofit organization actually worked directly with local government. And that's when I got to really understand what was going on in local government. It was a county and two cities that helped to fund the environmental education work that we were doing. And I sat on things like greenways committees and other environmental committees as part of that. And that really opened my eyes to the power of what working with local governments was. So when I went back and got my PhD in coastal resource management at East Carolina University, I was really interested in looking at how we communicate these scientific ideas, and how I was especially interested in seeing how we can be more effective in doing this kind of communication. And so the focus of that work was looking at a brand new idea at the time, which was sea level rise, and nobody had heard about it at that time. And I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about it now. And I was very interested in what will be the best ways to communicate that. And after doing that work, that's when I moved to ODU and started actually trying to implement some of those ideas from my PhD work, which was pretty hard. So what I did at ODU, I worked with Virginia Sea Grant, which I was basically their climate resilience or coastal resilience specialist, working with communities to try to help them understand what their how science and a better understanding, planning, and some of these tools could be used to better understand what the problems were, and then also to help prioritize and come up with solutions. So kind of bringing the ideas coming out of our universities extending that out to the community, and then also bringing those research questions back. So just a little bit about my background and where I'm coming from. And so in science education, in science communication, what we want to do is really break down that barrier between scientific research, which you all are doing in your graduate degrees, to allow other people, and these could be everyday people. I'm not going to necessarily focus. I know a lot of what you're doing now as a student may be talking to other students or your professors or those kinds of folks about, doing the best communication about your research to those folks. I'm going to talk more about talking to more everyday people, and it's really, really important because what we do, how we communicate what we do in our science is important, and what we do affects the world, and we're making these contributions. You all are making contributions to society through your work, and it's best to communicate that. So the process would be to ask these kinds of questions. And so the 4 questions I'm going to focus on in science communication are sort of why, what's the purpose of your communication? And this is what you were going to want to ask yourself as you start to prepare your communications. Who do you want to communicate? Who is your audience? What is the message that you want to, and how do you craft that message? And then how are you going to get to them? What's the communication channel? And so the first question I'd like to ask you is, why would you want to communicate? Maybe some of you what is your communication goal? So please, type that into a chat. I would sort of like to see what your answers, to those questions are for that purpose. So what's your communication goal? Maybe kind of put on your hat. There you go. We're starting to see those. As these come in, I'll sort of continue on. So knowing your goal is really important, right? Is your goal a general awareness? You want to kind of, have people have some general understanding of what your topic is? Or are you trying to educate? Do you have some education goals, certain points, like are they getting, CEUs or something like that, where you need to have an education goal there? Are you communicating with the public in order to have them engage with your project? Is this something where you want interaction with the community? Is there a particular position that you're advocating for? That's something, or sort of a general rule that you're advocating for, or are you trying to influence a policy in some way? Are you trying to provide background information that might then lead to a particular policy? Many of you may be wanting to get a job, and the people that you're talking to may not know your specific science area. So in that case, they might be more of a public audience. And I see some of these others in the chat, and I see some ideas around improving health. That would be maybe an advocacy type of thing. Fund research, of course. That's a great idea. That's a great, and that may also be part of a policy initiative as well. So yeah, it's a lot of stay away from advocacy. Okay, so advocacy can be a very specific advocacy, advocating for a specific policy, or it might be advocating for, some people may use that word in a very general way to advocate for a particular thing. I've heard people say that they advocate for clean water. So I would hope we all advocate for clean water, but at any rate, yeah, we stay away from political advocacy for sure as state employees. Yep. Okay. So at any rate, so the next thing is your audience. So what kind of audiences do you want to reach? And again, that could be something that you might tell me about as well. Like what are the kind of audiences that you all are thinking about? And these might be sort of a general type of audience that you don't necessarily know who's going to show up. But the more information you can get about your audience before you step into the room, the better. So if you do know what kind of audience, and these are the questions you might want to ask about your audience. What is their level of interest? Are you walking into an audience that, yeah, I'd love to hear what an audience, in the chat, like what is an audience you want to reach? So maybe people are, have to be there for some other reason, or you've been invited to come speak at a, Rotary Club meeting, and they haven't necessarily come to hear you speak. They've come just for the meeting. So that might be an audience where, they might be interested, they might not be interested, their level of interest might not necessarily be completely known. But if you do know the level of interest, that's very helpful. How knowledgeable are they about your topic? I mean, that's very important to know. And they may have some kind of contextual knowledge, like you can maybe understand, maybe have some idea of their level of education, for instance, or general knowledge about this kind of topic without knowing very specific things about your topic. Again, those are things to ask yourself as you put together your presentation. Demographics might be important. And sometimes if you don't know your audience, understanding the demographics about who that audience probably is might help you make some guesses about some of the needs that an audience might have. And then again, beliefs, values, attitudes, these are all really important things to consider as you think about your audience. Again, I always have a hard time about to say I know my audience, because a lot of things are not completely known. But just like when we asked me to talk to you all, I had lots of questions about who you all might be. So that helped me to kind of inform what some of my remarks were today. So again, this is an important thing that you need to think about. Partly because you also want to find common ground with your audience. I mean, that's one of the things that's really important in science communication is to make, I think it's really important to make science attainable for them, to make sure that you are understood. In order to make sure that you're best understood, you really need to know as much as you can about your audience. And it'll never be perfect. And you may be talking to several audiences at once. And so that might be something you have to deal with as well, to appeal to some audiences in one way and other audiences in another way. So I'll give an example of something that I used to do, not that much when I was an ODU, but previously when I did environmental education, is I was asked to come to a fair or a festival or something like that. And I didn't necessarily know who would show up, but you might have some things that kids, if kids were there, might be able to engage with your topic, versus some things that adults, could engage with on your topic. So, again, it kind of depends on the context. You need to ask questions of whoever's organizing the talk or the event. or that kind of thing, to kind of understand who that audience is. But it is important to ask those questions so that you can find that common ground. Okay, so the next step is probably the part that you're going to focus most on, which is crafting your message. And I sort of grabbed this cartoon because I thought this cartoon kind of might, a lot of people might feel like scientists, maybe talk above their head, and that can be very frustrating for an audience that really does want to learn about what your topic is. So one of the things, these, in some ways, some of these things are just general, when you're putting together a presentation. This could be for any audience. Start and end with the most important information, the take-home message. Some folks will give a whole outline of the talk. I tend to skip that part. It depends on your audience, whether you want to say, I'm going to tell you this, and then I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to tell you that. You can do that. But at the very minimum, I think you want to start and end with your most important message or information that you want to get across. And then so important is using simple language. And you might think of this as avoiding jargon, is another way that people talk about using simple language. You want to use the language as appropriate for your audience. And when you're talking with when you're defending your thesis or dissertation or whatever, talking in very technical language is very appropriate because you're demonstrating that you understand that technical language. And the reason we use that language is it has a level of precision that you may not achieve with simple language. So there is definitely a role for what we might call jargon, or very specific language to your field. And I know you all are learning that language or using that language, learning how to better use it. But if you're talking to a general audience, I think just reflect on, how would you talk to your neighbor about this? Or how would you talk to your family member that doesn't understand necessarily the technical language? So to make it understandable, to make it appropriate for the audience. And again, that's where, knowing your audience is very important. And again, you want to avoid acronym. Boy, I'm doing work with the Department of Defense right now. I almost said DoD, right? That's an acronym in and of itself, which probably you all know what I'm talking about with DoD. But you want to avoid those acronyms. And some of us work in fields where there are lots of acronyms, and there's a reason for that. It's hard to say these long terms, all the time. And it's just a real quick way to talk to people, but it does create confusion outside of your field because sometimes those acronyms mean different things in different fields. The same letters could mean something else completely different. So it's important to avoid uncommon abbreviations, very technical terms. If you can just explain that same thing in simple language, it's so important. And one thing that is a very one of the things that I sort of, as I was working on putting this together, I was reminded of from some communication work I had done in the past was words with dual meanings. And again, this might be something that, we all know when we're saying mean, when we're talking about an average and a mean in a graph but somebody else, in plain language, the word mean has a different meaning, right? So you have to kind of think about words with dual meanings. It could be as simple as that, or it could be other more complex words. And I have a link in here, and I can send it as well, or I can get it. I can put it in the chat for this Watch Your Words this is actually from the AGU, from the American Geophysical Union. So it's a little bit more towards words that would be for earth sciences, but probably any of these professional organizations would have similar words. But these were general science words and also words that are used in earth sciences in particular with this one. So again, it might be something just to think about as you craft your message. In there are these, there's either 3 or 4. This particular graphic uses 4 models of science communication. The main message to get to for the models of science and science communication is kind of moving away from this deficit model that was a very traditional form of science communication, which is, scientists as the experts, filling in the gap in the public's knowledge about a particular topic. That may actually be the right model for you to use in a particular instance. And this one-way sort of information delivery model, and you can, the contextual model helps to be a little bit more informed in still delivering this message. So again, asking some questions about what kind of communication is really need within a context, but still delivering that message. But there is a movement towards doing more public engagement type science communication. And some of you may be really doing this kind of communication depending on what your role is, what kind of job you're doing. Might be more in this public engagement. Certainly in something like Sea Grant, extension work, outreach work, maybe even if you're a technical expert working for a government that is trying to communicate with the public, this may be the kind of model that that would be preferable to use, which is where you can kind of engage with the public and collaborate and talk back and forth and understand that the people that you talk to will have information that is useful to you. And we're seeing this sometimes with folks in some of my colleagues that are working with, for example, indigenous tribes that have, traditional knowledge, that they engage with them as another knowledge holder. You can think of the public, you may want to understand what the public is seeing, on the ground. They have a different knowledge that they're holding, places that flood in Hampton Roads. This is some work that we and I did back a few years ago. We're interested in exchanging knowledge. We can bring some scientific knowledge. They're bringing their lived experience knowledge, perhaps, and we work together to build that as part of our science communication. So again, something to consider as you craft your message. What is the kind of model that you're looking for as you craft that message? And then engaging with your audience is so important to really think about how you can craft your message to be most engaging. And again, a few pointers about engaging with your audience. And again, you could have a whole hour-long seminar, just on some of these, telling a story. And again, somebody that is more of an expert in storytelling might be a good person to talk about this. One thing, so I jumped my list here, so sorry about that. So, again, 3 points, what matters most, try to keep it to 3 points is some advice that, especially with public audiences, telling a story. I started out with a sort of a personal story of my background. I'm going to tell a little bit more of that story in just a minute, in some of my examples. But telling stories, whether it's the story of your research. I mean, you can even tell a story about, obtaining your data and that kind of thing. Some of those stories really help the audience to understand the scientific information even a little bit better. And using examples and metaphors. I tried to pick engaging visuals for this presentation. I hope you found them engaging, to try to demonstrate some of these things. Some folks would be even better at doing visuals. I don't do my own visuals, but if you have a graphics person that you work with who could help you to develop some of your visuals, that's ideal, to tailor them to the information that you're trying to convey. So graphics, photos, data visualizations. I'm sure you all use in your science presentations a lot of graphs and understand how to visualize data. Think about how you might do that same kind of story, but maybe with formats that might be a little bit more attainable for the public. And don't do a no-no that I've seen many of my colleagues do, and how many of you have seen people, somebody presenting their data and saying, I know you can't read this data, or you can't read this, the data that's on this table because it's too small or whatever. I hate that. So don't do it. If pick a piece of the table and make it big enough in your slide to read, if you're doing a slide demonstration, or if you're trying to show that video, show that visual. Even if it's just a piece of a table or a graphic, don't include parts of the chart that people can't read or can't understand. At any rate, and then practice. Practice and get feedback on your presentation, so that you can improve in that. One of the things I had to do for my interview for the job at ODU is I had to do an elevator pitch, and I practiced that a lot because it's really hard to put your ideas into like a 3-minute time frame. Shorter time frames are harder than longer time frames for sure. And so my last topic is in putting this together is the how, which is choosing your channel. So my question to you is, how do you receive new information? How do you, like, you can use some of these ideas here, but when you're looking for, and it could be science information or it could be any kind of information, where do you get new information? Do you get it mostly from written materials, like articles, fact sheets? There you go. Blogs is a great one. I guess I have web content. I guess maybe blogs would fit in web content. Or I could even ask you, like, what is your favorite way to get, maybe you use all these ways to get information. What are your favorite ways to receive information? And as you choose your channel, that's also going to feed back to, how you craft your message. So if you're using social media to get your message out there, you're going to want to have a lot of something very visual, or you might want to use video in a social media post, but you want a very short message in general. One of the things I do a lot is presentations or events. So I do a lot of talking types of things. Journalism is another one that you might work with a somebody that understands that medium and how to write an article, a journalistic article, a magazine article. I actually did this as a graduate student. I worked with North Carolina Sea Grant and wrote a couple of articles for a magazine that they were producing at the time. And so I tried to mimic the way that they wrote, and then they kind of helped me rewrite it so it looked right. But it was very short sentences. It was lots of quotes or expository kind of messages. So journalism is a great way to reach a different audience. And again, it's something you may want to work with somebody specifically on. And another one is infographics. And a lot of these different types of channels, you're probably going to need someone to help facilitate that way of communicating. But these are great opportunities to get your information out there. And so you might want to think, I'm actually working on some messages for a podcast that so I've been on a couple of podcasts, and I try to write out what I'm going to say because I don't want to do the during the podcasts. But you also want to sound impromptu as well, to be very engaging on a podcast. So I'm trying to think of how to balance that as well. And so, you don't necessarily have to be perfect, but it's important to think about these as you craft your message. Okay, so there's a couple of special types of science communication. One of these that I looked a lot when I was a graduate student was risk communication, which focuses specifically on encouraging risk-reducing behavior. Those of you that are in health sciences may do a lot of this kind of risk reducing. That's where a lot of risk communication literature comes out of. And we worked in coastal hazards, and so we're trying to understand the professors that I worked with as a graduate student there. Many of them were working on communicating the cone of uncertainty for hurricanes and that kind of thing. Very difficult thing. They are always working on how to better communicate that and try to get people to act appropriately to get out of the way of the storm. Op-eds or opinion pieces, sometimes that's an effective communication tool, and people, I haven't ever done one of those, but I would encourage you, if you've got a particular position, those might be interesting to read. I'm sure some of your professors have done some op-eds that might be interesting to look at that. And then programs for children and youth, science festivals, those kinds of things I talked about. I used to be in that world a lot. And that's a lot of fun. It's nice to bring your science to a new audience. So again, you might want to work, if that's not something you're real familiar with, you might want to work with somebody in science ed that might have some expertise in how to model your message. But it is a great opportunity to think about how you can get that message to the next generation of scientists and encourage the next generation of scientists. So I want to talk about one example that I've worked with, which was climate change communication. And I still am in the climate change communication business. And although I don't tend to have to communicate to people that are skeptical, like in this cartoon, right? So that's one of the special, it's sort of a special case in a lot of ways, although I'm hearing that folks in other areas, this particularly happened during the pandemic, and some of you may have had some experience with that you get a lot of skepticism. And climate change communication can be real challenging. Some of it, and I feel like over the last 15 years-ish that I've been working in climate change communication, that some of this has broken through, partly because we've had so many impacts from climate change. But the idea that the impacts are delayed, much of the actions that we've done that have caused climate change were decades ago, and we're feeling the impacts now. People have a hard time with that as a mental model. They're used to, things that you do now, having an impact immediately. And so there are some difficulties with talking about climate change in that aspect, but also the uncertainty of what the future is going to be is something we are dealing with for sure. Like, people, again, there's a lot of discomfort around uncertainty, and communicating uncertainty is very difficult, but is essential to say, okay, we've got a range of possibilities of things that might happen in the future, partly depending on actions that we might take in the present. And also, some people have difficulty understanding like how one thing can cause another, like something that is very different, like driving, cars, causes carbon. Again, most of us understand the greenhouse effect and understand climate, but there could be segments of the audience that really have a hard time with causation. And even scientists have some, talking about extreme weather, we have always had storms. That is true. How these storms are being supercharged, I think we've gotten better at how we communicate this, but it still is difficult to communicate that climate change has supercharged many of our storms. And this is why we're seeing, different kinds of storms, lots more rain, out in the West, fire, impacts, not just in the West, but in dry areas, I guess I should say, greater fire impacts and those kinds of things. And then people also have a guilt bias. So emotions get into this difficulty in communicating climate change as well as politics. So climate change is a little fraught. One of the very helpful things about climate change communication, they've had a long-term study called the Global Warming Six Americas that you might be interested in, that's looked at audience segmentation and has done interviews with people over decades now, since 2008, they've been doing these Six Americas studies, and they have actually shown, this just shows the last 10 years, how that's changed, and how actually while we still always have this sort of doubtful and dismissive sector in our public, the majority of the public is actually very engaged with this idea of climate change, and more of them are becoming alarmed. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's happened that I've seen over my career working in climate change communication. Disengaged has really been persistent, but the numbers of folks that have gone from doubtful, it's probably everybody's moving up a category to some extent. We've seen a lot of change. And how do you overcome these barriers? When I was going out and talking to people about climate change and sea level rise, I tried to appeal to common values and make connections, talk about what people care about, what they're experiencing. I would try to distinguish between climate and weather, and talk about how the things that we can do now can make a big difference. So these were some of the things that I tried to talk about. The research that I did actually showed fatalism to be a very common kind of response when I went to talk to people about sea level rise, where those that did understand what I was talking about, because a lot of people just thought that was flooding, it wasn't something that is progressively getting worse. But those that did understand it often were very fatalistic about, hey, it's going to happen, nothing I can do about it. Well, no, there's a lot that we can talk about. I mean, I didn't say no because I was doing research, but as I went out and talked to people about things that they can do, I did try to stress that we can make a difference. We can think about this. We can plan for it. We can, we have to consider the options that we have and what we can do about this. And I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I have one more topic that I'm just gonna touch on, which is an emerging issue that, again, you could have a whole hour-long presentation about misinformation and disinformation. I work with some of my colleagues in Sea Grant to do a session at a recent Sea Grant, a wide conference that we held. And I've learned a lot about this because of that. The idea of these three categories of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. We didn't get too much into the malinformation, which is, you can kind of see some examples there of leaked private information and things like that that are very directed. Generally, we in doing outreach and engagement tend to run into misinformation and sometimes disinformation. Some of my colleagues in particular, and I have a little bit of experience with this in climate change of people that were sort of funded to come in and say, well, I'm a scientist and I don't believe in climate change. And they had a little bit of a sketchy background, but anyway, sometimes that happens, and that would be in that sort of disinformation category. But we mostly focus on the misinformation, and some of the drivers with misinformation are both many of these drivers that I talked about with climate change drivers are these cognitive problems that people maybe cannot parse between some of the different scientific ideas that they don't necessarily understand how to source the information or understand what kind of other information is out there that may show this to be, wrong. And then there's also the idea that emotions and worldviews and things like that can really feed into this. So if you have sort of ideas that may seem like they might be plausible, and then you have a worldview that supports, that's sort of a recipe for misinformation and believing in misinformation. And one of the ideas on how to deal with misinformation or disinformation is this idea of inoculation, which is designed to sort of as people get exposed to disinformation, you sort of help to warn them that they're being misled, and you provide the science communication in a way that they can easily understand this and easily have maybe a better acceptance of the science information. And then as you try to neutralize the misinformation, talk about the flaws and the evidence that shows that it's misinformation, and also sort of teach people how to debunk on their own. You can fact check, you can debunk, but then also, encourage healthy skepticism and ways to kind of fact check on your own, and provide them some tools to understand what different media is, and where it originates from. That kind of can help to inoculate misinformation. And I can send along, if you guys are interested in more resources about misinformation or disinformation, I can share with you some of the resources that we shared at our session that we did. So I don't pretend to be the expert on this. This is sort of some things. There's also a great video from an expert that I can send along somebody that actually the Department of Naval Research funded to help people to understand. And so consistent with my message, I will end with my main point, is that when we want to talk about science, we want to have engaging science. That's, I think, a goal that I would like to pose for you, that might be a goal that you might want to have, so that we can strengthen the connection between science and the community, and increase confidence in true scientific information, so that people will benefit from the science. If your research has been funded with public monies, as much of mine has, I feel you have an obligation to communicate that to the public, so that that is shared and understood. And I guess we have about 10 minutes left for questions and discussion. Yeah, I'd love to talk with you about this. So I'm going to stop sharing, okay? And please
Thank
feel
you,
free,
Michelle.
yeah, turn on your.
So, you can turn on your mics and ask your question, or there is a message in the chat, so I'll read that for you and for the audience. You mentioned the need to understand an audience's knowledge of topic and context. It is also important to understand an audience's basic science competencies or level of science literacy. So, how do you craft a message for an audience that includes people with different levels of science literacy?
Yes, so that is a difficult segmentation to do. And that would lead me back to what is my goal. And I think that for example, if I was going out to talk about climate change to a group of seniors that might be, and I did this in Virginia Beach, went out to talk to a group of seniors gathered at a senior center, and I did not know their different levels of science literacy. I actually tried to shoot low, and tried to explain things as basic, as basic as possible, but leave room for people that want more information and more details. So that was my approach to it. I'd be interested to hear if anybody else that does this would have a different approach. Well, anyway, that's the way I do it.
So Keely has a follow-up. Says some have advocated for the use of science translators to facilitate communication between scientists and the public. Do you think it is better for scientists to learn how to communicate scientific information themselves, or are there advantages to using translators?
I guess it depends on the scientist and the goals. One might argue that that's my position now I don't do a lot of scientific research. I kind of shifted to doing social science research with my PhD, that I'm a science translator. I use other people's research and talk about other people's research. We kind of think of ourselves as boundary spanners, so we try to go beyond maybe just translating into that area of engagement, participation, really trying to also hear back from the folks that we're engaging with about what their science needs are. So we're trying to go both ways with that. I think there would be advantages to using science translators in that sense. I think if we talk about extension people, many of my colleagues are embedded in the communities that they are trying to communicate with, so they have a better understanding of those communities than somebody coming in, raw from either living in a different community or, principally interested in their research. area. So I would say that if the boundary spanners not only provide that translation, opportunity, but also can provide good insights to the scientist, if that's what they're looking for in communication. Yeah.
And Michelle, I would also add that sometimes the science translators are more beneficial when you're scientists, despite maybe having learned and practiced the communication, but just feel don't feel as comfortable interacting and engaging. And I think you would much rather have someone who is able to interface between the science and the public than putting a scientist out there who doesn't feel as comfortable in communicating that information to the audience, because then in my mind, the efficacy of this science communication really hinges on the ability to connect with that audience. And when you have a scientist that is somewhat uncomfortable connecting, you lose kind of at that interface between the science and the audience. So I think recognizing that there are going to be scientists who are not comfortable going out and kind of maybe communicating maybe more directly with the general public. Again, it goes back to the audience. I think scientists might be more comfortable, some scientists might be more comfortable communicating with an audience that might have a higher level of science knowledge, but really trying to bring it down to really kind of the fundamental level of a general public might be more challenging.
Yeah, and I think a pairing up is great, because it's nice for people to actually see that scientists are, living, breathing people too. Right?
And Sierra asks a question. Do you have any advice for developing community presentations or outreach material for coastal communities when you are not a community member and maybe do not have a great understanding of the community itself? So how can you connect with the group in a way that develops trust?
Well, the easy thing is to make a connection with somebody that is there. I mean, I'll always sort of promote Sea Grant or maybe even Ag Extension, Virginia Tech Extension, for people that are on the ground that understand both science and their communities that they are embedded in. But if that is something that you do not have access to, the next person, and again, it depends on what your material is. Like if it's something like, I did a lot of work with governments, and the planners in the governments were great to work with, because they really also are doing a lot of that translation type of science translation. So I found planners, or in the really small communities. I did some work out on the Eastern Shore, and we engaged with even a town manager, planner kind of person that was, I mean, they were like one of the few employees for the community. Another place, again, it depends on the community. Another group that we engaged with were health educators out in rural communities, talking to them about what they know about that community, what is meaningful to that community. They kind of knew what was going on out there. So it kind of depends on what your topic area is. Sometimes they're on the ground soil and water conservation people. It's for the kind of work I did, the community, the local government folks were a real good resource.
So thank you, Michelle, and thank you all of our workshop participants for joining us today.